I don't recall there being something we discussed to pick up from the last time we met.
Well, we never really returned to the transhumanism stuff. We did a little bit, but we mostly mostly focused on human AI interactions, and that's fine. But we did leave off of the transhumanism stuff. So I don't know if you felt we covered that
no,
sufficiently.
no, we could dive
So
back into that.
yeah, that stuff is always interesting to me, and uh, yeah, there is this. I mean, there are always interesting things, of course, happening in the AI space. There are a few interesting pieces of news and some interesting papers that I've seen come out in the last couple of weeks that might be worth touching on. So there are a number of different topics we could talk about. Dan, offline from the seminar here, I did send you over a paper.
Yeah.
This is one that I didn't go through in much detail, and you may understand it better than me. But the upshot of it, which I found quite interesting, is that a team built a very, very small, almost a toy transformer model, deliberately with the aim of being able to, put in enough brute force, blood, sweat, and tears to actually unravel how it does what it does. To actually make the black box scrutable. And their main focus was to figure out how the model had learned to do the additions operation.
Mm-hmm.
And what they discovered was sort of a comically convoluted Rube Goldberg style, Dr. Seuss kind of contraption, just a hilariously inefficient and roundabout way of getting to that capability, as it were. And now, whether or not this generalizes to other models, I think that's an open question. I'm not in a position to be able to evaluate whether or not their findings would generalize to all token prediction models, or LLMs, or whatever we want to call them. But the conversation that I saw around this topic was, well, isn't that funny? These models really aren't all that efficient, and maybe they don't work that well, and obviously they aren't intelligent in the way that a human being is, because human beings don't necessarily apply such inefficient methods to arrive at end results. And I had two responses to that. The first one was, well, human beings do things pretty inefficiently when you think about it. And we try to take shortcuts, and we try to use handy heuristics, but we're pretty kludgy ourselves. That's number one. But the main one was that, holy moly, if this is widespread in these big models, then that implies there's massive hardware overhang. Because if there were a way to do these operations 100 or 1,000 times more efficiently, and those could be identified and implemented by an AGI or ASI, then yeah, I mean, that's exactly the sort of hardware overhang that we were worrying about before, right? Which is that these systems are able to perform, pretty extraordinarily. And if they're doing so under conditions of extreme inefficiency, then that suggests there's massive overhang. At least that was the big thing that occurred to me. And now I don't know, maybe it's only for a handful of operations and functions, and it's not sort of general across all of the capabilities that these models have. But that was the first thing that came to my mind, is not ha ha ha, look at how inefficient and dumb the machine is. It was, no, my gosh, this is what we're worried about, that there's massive hardware overhang. And as soon as this thing figures out how to economize itself, the FOOM becomes much more of a real concern. If it was already just optimized to the razor's edge, and there was no more performance you could squeeze out of it, that would be some consolation, right? But oh no, that was exactly what I didn't want to hear about these models with respect to the overhang concern. So there you are.
Yeah, so actually I'm pretty familiar with that paper. So that's Neil Nanda and collaborators. Yeah, we actually had Nanda was speaking in one of the seminars here last week on exactly that paper. So maybe you can check out.
Oh, wow. I had no idea. Well, how cool is that?
Yeah, I'll put the video up at some point. You can take a look. I think I have a bit of a different take. So I don't think that the solution is a Rube Goldberg machine. So I don't know if this changes. Maybe this is a comfort. You have to, it's sort of, once you take into account the nature of the architecture, so of course you could imagine a more straightforward solution to doing modular addition. So it's not just straight up addition, it's modular addition, right? So you have to add the numbers and then keep subtracting multiples of 20, say, to get a number less than 20, and that's your answer. So you add up two numbers modulo 20 or some other number. So you can imagine a solution which is more efficient than what it did. But as a mathematician, when you look at the solution it found, it's actually quite beautiful and elegant and actually general. So although it's only, actually I don't remember if it's trained to do modular addition for multiple bases. So if it has to do it mod 20 and then also mod 13, I think it's a fixed number, say 20. But the algorithm it learned actually would generalize, if I remember correctly, to other bases. So I'd say it's actually a pretty neat solution. Maybe there's a more efficient one, but it's every piece of that algorithm, at least the way that Nanda presented it, it's basically just changing coordinates. So it changes from the input coordinates, which are numbers, to coordinates, which are angles around a circle, and then basically does the most efficient thing possible to add angles, and then converts them back. It's actually, and it learns more or less the same algorithm multiple times, in the sense that you run it from scratch and it sort of arrives at something similar. So I think I wouldn't actually characterize it the way you did. So maybe that's some comfort, because maybe there isn't so much overhang. It's about as efficient it could be, given its architecture.
I'm very, very relieved to find out that I didn't I mean, obviously, this is the thing, is if you're not a mathematician, or I should probably more accurately say, if you're not mathematically literate, which obviously I'm not at anywhere level it's necessary to actually understand and appreciate these things, then you could get all in a lather without knowing what the hell you're thinking about or talking about. And so to a completely uneducated and illiterate person, when you see, this is how the machine is doing, this is how the model is doing addition, and of course, without a full understanding of the distinction between modular addition and addition, and there looked like a lot of trigonometric terms in there. I saw, sine and cosine and so forth in there.
Yeah.
And it seemed, that sounds like a very roundabout sort of way of doing things. And then, of course, it's also, to me, an object lesson in not taking the comments on social media very serious about this, because, of course, accompanying the news link to these papers, there's always chatter, and I often scan through the chatter just to get a sense of what people are saying. And obviously, none of those people knew what the hell they were talking about either. So a lot of confidently wrong people around this particular paper. So that's a relief. This strikes me as really quite an important area of research. It would be. This is that question: is there a large overhang resulting from the efficiency or inefficiency with which capabilities are produced in these models or realized in these models? That strikes me as quite a fundamental question that I would very much like to know the answer to. I think that pertains really quite importantly and profoundly to the risk of AI capability increasing very quickly, and perhaps in a way that's uncontrolled. And so that would be, this would be a line of research that I would very much support, and I think deserves an immense amount of funding, for example, for us to try to get an answer to. I think that would be, so we were talking over the last couple of weeks, well, what is this this precautionary letter with the signatories asking for a slowdown or a halt, or a pause, rather, I suppose, to certain lines of research and modeling? What would it really hope to achieve, and how much should we really be committing to AI safety as a civilization? Yeah, this is the kind of thing where if I was President Biden, I would definitely be finding, rummaging in the couch for $100 million worth of change to throw at a project like this. I mean, absolutely, this is worth something to be funding and getting answers to. So yeah, right, yeah.
Yeah, it's there aren't that many people working on that kind of thing specifically. I mean, Nanda isn't really investigating kind of latent capabilities or how much of an overhang there is in the sense you're describing. His line of research is mostly just looking inside these models, trying to understand how they work. And there's, he said there's about 30 people in the world who sort of work more or less full time doing that. There is a pretty rapid, relative to 30, increase in interest. So partly that's what my group is doing now. So not exactly in the style that Nanda is doing it, but similar, with similar goals. Regarding the overhang, yeah, it's interesting that in the current era, of course, it's capabilities at the cutting edge are one thing, right? So GPT-4 can do has some specific capabilities that earlier models didn't have. That's interesting, but obviously you need a lot of resources to push the frontier, and so there needs to be a feedback loop for these major players where they're also deploying the models and moving an economic needle somewhere in order to continue feeding the engine of progress at the cutting edge. And that, the economic part, is largely driven by much smaller models. So if you think about ChatGPT, most people, I presume, aren't signed up for GPT-4, the paid option. They're using GPT 3.5, which is what people mean by ChatGPT. That is likely to be on the order of 10 billion parameters as compared to hundreds of billions for GPT-4. Nobody knows exactly. So the process of RLHF, reinforcement learning from human feedback, which refines the model, can also be used to shrink it. So the models that are actually run, I mean, if you're going to run something at scale with millions of simultaneous users, and you need to be using as few GPUs per instance of that as you can. So you cram as much of the capability of the cutting edge model as you can into a much smaller model, and that is possible. So maybe much more than you would intuitively think. You can cram something more or less as capable as GPT 3.5 into something on the order of 10 billion parameters, as we're sort of familiar with in this seminar from discussing Llama and Alpaca and all these open source models, which are largely on that scale, although probably not quite as capable as GPT 3.5. So that's in some sense an overhang, right? So it means that when you get the cutting edge capability, you're not optimizing for small size at the time because you're just going for the capability. But soon thereafter, you can expect that through various tricks, you're going to be able to achieve similar performance at a much more scalable size that can, potentially run on edge devices like phones and be deployed more widely and in much more real time, right? So GPT-4 is slow enough that you probably don't want a live interaction with an AI running GPT-4. Like if it's running voice and you want to be able to interject into a conversation like you can do with a human, it's going to feel like it's a little bit slow for that. But models that are much smaller will run much faster.
So I guess this is where, again, my illiteracy is obviously a major obstacle to understanding here. But my crude understanding is that you sort of have you have pre-training slash training as a phase, you have fine tuning as a phase, and you have sort of inference or slash running. I don't know if there's a distinction between the inference and running the model from the perspective of a user. But that's my crude understanding, is that there are these different phases, these different stages, and that the sort of compactification of larger models into smaller ones that are quite capable, don't perform quite as well. The one is dependent upon the other. So that, for example, now maybe this is changing, maybe this is no longer the case, but I mean, it's been an hour since I last looked at this. I'm being facetious, but in the last few weeks, this may well have changed. No joke at all. But the last time I checked, my understanding was, when we were talking about whether or not Google has a moat based on that memo that leaked out, the thinking was, well, if you want a very small but nevertheless high performance model in inference mode for an end user, for example, like Alpaca or the sort of the Llama Alpaca kind of stuff, that those still need to be obtained from, and with the benefit of a much larger pre-trained and then fine-tuned model. That you can't shortcut around that the very small high performance models must be built out of the bigger very, very capable models, and that you can't necessarily build a high performance small model without the benefit of the big ones to guide the process. Now, I don't know if that's still true, but that was my understanding as of, I don't know, 3 weeks ago or something like that. Is that a correct understanding, or is that wrong?
It could change, but I think that's the current understanding, yeah.
And so then another question that comes to my mind here is around hardware, are the devices, so I've been seeing a lot about the what NVIDIA has just recently released the H100 architecture, I think, that chip set, and there are others that have been around for longer. NVIDIA has the older ones. What are the A100s? I think Google has tensor processing units. There are other companies that are working on custom silicon. Apple's got some custom. I think a lot of people have custom silicon. Tesla has this big Dojo supercomputer architecture that they're developing. So my question, again, being very ignorant here in this general area, is the hardware optimized for one of the stages, or is it for sort of pretty much equally effective across all of the stages: pre-training, training, fine-tuning, and inference? Is it the same hardware for all of those, or are we looking at a future where there will be sort of architectures developed and dedicated to performance optimizing for those different stages? Like, does the chip optimized for the inference stage look different architecturally than the chips that are do the pre-training and the fine-tuning, or is it all just the same GPU-based style accelerators or whatever they are?
It's a good question. I'm not an expert. Currently, there isn't really a big distinction. So they are different. So the training and inference workloads are different. I'll try and explain why in a moment. To my understanding, I mean, most of the hardware that's being used is NVIDIA hardware, and then there's TPUs, and I think some custom silicon at Meta that's starting to be used. But I think it's a bit of a rounding error compared to NVIDIA's dominance of the space, as their recent stock price sort of indicates. So the NVIDIA chipsets, they don't, I think, have architecturally a big distinction between the parts of the chip that are used for training and inference. You could, so that might be wrong. Maybe there's the H100, and then there's some specific, maybe there are some less like headline chips that are kind of specifically for inference. I haven't really paid attention. But whether or not that's true now, it certainly makes sense over the long term for there to be kind of specialization. Of course, there are advantages to scale, right? So that's partly why NVIDIA wins, even though their chips aren't as tailored to some of these specific workloads as some of their competitors. They just operate at such a large scale that they win anyway. I think for the moment that's true, that you don't really get enough of a benefit from sort of separating out the training versus inference, that that people are sort of betting heavily on that. Probably that comes over time, but I'm guessing for a few years at least, it'll mostly just be you grab whatever, as many as possible of NVIDIA's latest chips, which of course are pushing the performance frontier, but largely, as I understand it, the H100 isn't faster than the A100. It's just much cheaper to run. So this is about, we're sort of entering the phase of this development where to get to the next rung, you need to be spending so many billions of dollars that it really needs to be like the budget needs to work out for how you make money on the other end. And if you're going to spend $1 billion buying H100s, you're doing a very careful calculation about the inference cost per query on the other side. For example, if you're Google, it only makes sense to be deploying things like Bard if you actually expect to make money. I mean, you can just burn piles of cash like Microsoft is doing, embedding GPT-4 into Office and Windows and everything all over the place. I can't imagine they're going to make money immediately out of that. It's a play to sort of dominate and make sure no competitors can use this window of opportunity to steal their crown in Office and other spaces. But I just don't see how, unless Office 365 subscription prices go up substantially, how they expect to not take a big hit to their bottom line from doing that. So, yeah, at the moment, I don't think there's a big distinction, no. But they are different. I said I was going to say a bit how they're different. So during training, you're doing back propagation, right? So you pass examples forward through the model to get its predictions. And in inference, that's all you do. And then you serve the prediction, whether that's the next token or whatever. You serve it back to the user, that's it. In training, you take the prediction, you compare it to the true value, and then you work backwards through the model to calculate how the weights in the model should change in order to bring that prediction more in line with the fact. And that backwards pass requires a lot of memory, because you have to store all the activations at each neuron during the forward pass. And that can be a lot if you have 175 billion parameters. So it requires a lot of memory. It requires a lot of interconnect between the different chips, because you can't fit the model on just one chip. So you need very high bandwidth interconnect, which is where NVIDIA's real advantage lies. I think that's underappreciated. Their NVLink and other patented technology about how to connect many GPUs together to essentially make one giant GPU. This is, as an NVIDIA investor, the reason why I think NVIDIA is in a very strong position. It's not enough just to have a GPU. The interconnect is what makes their DGX kind of supercomputers actually worth all the money, is that they really do. I mean, the speed of interconnect between GPUs these days is just mind-blowing. So it almost does really function as a sort of giant GPU with a pooled memory, especially the latest models. It's quite astonishing. So yeah, you need all that in order to do the back propagation and share the updates between the different sort of parts of the model living on different chips. And that's all very demanding, especially at the cutting edge of model sizes. Yeah.
Okay, thanks for that. That's really interesting and very helpful.
Maybe let's change tack and talk about transhumanism again.
Sure, always a fun topic. I like that.
I'm not sure where we left off. We were sort of discussing the political aspects of transhumanism, which is quickly going from a fringe concern. No offense, card-carrying transhumanist Adam Dorr, going from a fringe concern to, like parents on the playground wondering about whether they should upgrade their kids. That's
yeah. I mean, it is interesting to watch something that was so speculative for so long start to become real enough that it deserves serious consideration. I think when things start to become practical. And it's interesting to see how people who've been paying attention for a long time deal with the emergence of the realization of what were for a very long time just speculations, and as well as it's interesting to see how people who were never, this was never on their radar, how they are reacting to this as new information and a new phenomenon and fundamentally unfamiliar circumstance to face. And so I find both of those things interesting phenomena to observe. And obviously for myself, I can sort of, introspect a bit because this is stuff I've been thinking about for a long time. But it's been interesting to see the general public react to science fiction becoming science fact in AI and transhumanism a bit, of course, as well. And then it's also been interesting to see the communities that have been waiting for this and anticipating this and speculating about it for so long, to see how they react to the genuine article finally coming along, and how right were we, how wrong were we, what, those sorts of things are interesting to introspect on. So it's a, and then on top of that, transhumanism is loaded with some additional freight that other technology disruptions maybe don't necessarily have. I mean, there are technologies that feel sort of immediate or intimate or are somehow more gripping and elemental. So food is a good example of one where you just have such an intimate and direct connection to.
But the technological disruption you're talking about is the disruption of flesh, right? And it's hard to say it's not fundamental.
Yeah, I mean, well, this is the thing. Is so some disruptions have felt very abstract, very sterile and at arm's length. The energy is a kind of an abstract concept. Electricity is a bit abstract. And materials in some ways are abstract. Transportation in some ways is abstract. Food is very immediate and concrete, and you literally, it's what you put in your body and so forth. And so any disruption, any new technology, any change with respect to food is something that we feel in perhaps a more intimate way. And healthcare perhaps is also an example of that. And then in the case of transhumanism, it's an example. And flesh, precisely, Dan, is the thing that is our bodies, our physical embodiment. This is more intimate. Its implications are something that you can't help but relate to, because you are going to be involved if the technology touches your life, it's literally going to touch you, and it isn't something that you can abstract yourself away from or keep at arm's length or just view from afar. Transhumanism, anything that does go mainstream is going to be something that is kind of impossible to ignore, and that, I think, like food does, really arouses people's passions and creates very strong opinions. And so all of the typical ideological and political and other lenses that shape and motivate our reactions to a new technology, they're all dialed up to 11 on the intensity meter when it involves our bodies or our food or these sorts of intimate and immediate things. So that's been interesting to see as well, like what people's reactions to any technology or social changes that involve our bodies and our food. Yeah, they're very provocative in a way that, like, you know, people from my mom, like my parents, for example, who are approaching their 80s. You know, they go in the house, they switch the lights on, the lights come on. They don't really know or care all that much where the electricity is coming from. I mean, they know a little bit about the technology, but it's abstract. It's distant. It's stuff they don't relate to. But they do think about, you know, when they go to the grocery store, are they going to buy that weird new fake meat or not? And they are going to think about, well, geez, do you get the vaccine that de-ages you 10 years or whatever? I mean, is that something you're going to do? Are you going to get the implant that gives you XYZ, you know, benefit or capability? Or, you know, I mean, they wouldn't be able to ignore that the way they can ignore where the electricity comes from when they flip the light switch on. So this is one reason why I'm interested in transhumanism beyond just, you know, sort of the speculative possibilities of that it opens up for us. It's also fascinating from a social and psychological perspective to watch and observe the reactions to these technologies now that they're just starting to perhaps be, you know, we're seeing them creep over the, you know, what's the right metaphor? We're seeing the masts of the ships start to poke up above the horizon in the distance. You know, we can just barely start to see some of these things become real. So, yeah, it's an exciting time, and it's a fun time to be a student of these kinds of phenomena if they're interesting. So, interesting to you.
Is Larry Page publicly sort of affiliated with transhumanism?
I honestly don't know. I mean, there are luminaries in the you know, there's some high-profile people in the general community, and you can imagine there are a lot of Silicon Valley entrepreneurs and successful, you know, gazillionaires who, you know, they're interested in technology, they're interested in science fiction, and so these things fit naturally with some of the core ideas of transhumanism, both in just sort of as a general set of ideas, and then maybe more specifically as a, you know, a loosely organized social movement. But I honestly don't know if I can recall seeing his name in any of the, you know, I haven't seen him in any of the meetings. Let's put it that
way. Yeah, it's just interesting. I mean, I guess it's quite public that Larry Page, I mean, Elon Musk has been sharing all over the place some conversations he had with Larry Page about AI and whether humans have a future. And I don't know if it's an accurate quote, but Larry Page is, according to Elon Musk, had said that, you know, it's kind of speciesist to think that we should prefer humans over some sort of either artificial intelligence or digital intelligence that's somehow based on our own. That seems like a pretty core transhumanist view, you would have to think. Yeah, I guess the aspect of transhumanism that seems to me to have become the most mainstream is longevity research. So that was, I think, in a basket with transhumanism, viewed with quite a lot of derision, maybe 10 years ago or longer, but has become, well, both very well funded and consequently pretty high status. And I don't think anybody looks down their nose and thinks it's stupid to do longevity research anymore. Maybe some still do, but at least in sort of Silicon Valley circles, you know, there's lots of VC funding. It's a kind of normal activity to go and work for a longevity research startup, which explicitly states as its aim to end aging. That's kind of a normal thing in 2023.
Yeah. It's been interesting to see how longevity in the medical community has become I guess it ceased to be a taboo research topic, yes, but also beyond that, the definitions and the framing of aging itself is something that it has evolved in the mainstream medical community, the medical research community, and it has evolved almost exclusively in the direction of what the transhumanist community, the longevity community, has been advocating for a couple of decades now, right? So the thinking for the last 20 years has been to say, well, aging is the right way to think about it. Is it's not an inevitable and natural process. It's the best way to think about it is as a disease of it itself, and as a it is the basis, the cause of many other diseases. In other words, other diseases are like heart disease, cognitive decline, including Alzheimer's, immune decline, and a whole bunch of other conditions that we associate, cancer even perhaps. These are things that happen to old people. They don't happen to young people, or very, very, very rarely. And so the idea that treating aging is a pathway to treating disease in general, and thinking of aging as a disease or as a medical problem, as opposed to just a fact of life or a natural, elemental, essential part of existence, is a major shift for how the medical community is positioned other research in relation to aging. So that's been a very, very big shift. That's been a part of what has, moved the Overton window on the whole business, right? And so in addition to kind of becoming less taboo, just as an idea, like, wouldn't it be great if we were able to extend life and then ideally not age at all? Beyond that, it changes. It's really fundamentally changed how we think about other diseases and so on. So it's been the longevity is a really good example.
I followed a little bit of. I don't know how directly it's connected to longevity research, but through a friend of mine, Michael Chapuis, who was asking me to look at a whole bunch of applications of sort of transformer models and other deep learning techniques to drug discovery and sort of some cutting edge ideas in biology. If you're not paying attention to some of this stuff, it's really easy to be bowled over by where we are today. People are literally, I don't know the exact terms, but they're like nanolipids, like little capsules, basically containing code that you can migrate around the body using radio signals, which direct where the microscopic sort of particle of a little package, basically a synthetic cell. You can navigate it around the body and deliver it to specific tissues, and it will, I guess one of the consequences of synthetic biology is a sort of understanding of how to basically program little, basically nano machines, although, not from the ground up, so we're not completely in control of them. But it's really not sci-fi to imagine a path from where we are if you can communicate better with those particles and use millions of them and analyze the data they send back, because they can also send signals out, maybe not in the current versions, but that's coming soon. It's really not that crazy to, modulo being able to actually effectively control those systems, which requires, that's where the AIs come in. It's really not crazy to imagine pretty radical changes in the way we think about health in terms of targeting individual tissues and getting pretty sophisticated readouts on what the immune system is doing and so on. So this is an aspect of the progress in AI that I find myself, I guess, actively shying away from, like not thinking through the implications. I guess like many people, I do expect AGI within 10 years or so. And that has as a consequence fairly shortly thereafter that all the lines of research I just described become easy, or much, much easier. And it's hard to actually see how that doesn't result in pretty profound progress in longevity research. So,
oh yeah, I mean, and there are multiple pathways to longevity. That's, repairing the body in situ. Taking a body that's older and finding ways to repair it. That's, that there are multiple ways, multiple sort of broad strategies for how to achieve the common goal of restoring function to a person while maintaining sort of the continuity of their consciousness. But that's just one, some way to intervene in a person's extant biology, in their body as it is, to correct problems that are there. But that's not the only option. I mean, there's a bigger smorgasbord of things on potential offer that could be developed. So growing replacement body parts, in vitro, and then replacing the stuff that's older and running and kind of worn out in your body is another option, including whole body replacement, like just everything from the neck down, or everything from the, other than the brain kind of thing. There's that's very likely to be a viable strategy. At least in principle. Now, how long it takes to realize it, who knows? And then, of course, there's the whole, proper cybernetics business, where you've got a mix of biology and then mechanical or artificial
did you
hardware.
Did you see that news article about I think it was a man whose paralysis was cured by bridging some gap in his spine with a
pretty amazing results. Yeah. And so, I mean, I think there's good reason to expect very rapid progress relative to the current rate of progress in a number of domains that bear upon the human condition, the human physical condition in general. Longevity is just one aspect of that. Longevity is a kind of physical ill health that lies ahead of all of us, barring barring technological progress to the contrary. All of us are going to grow old and fall into ill health and suffer and pass away. And if we don't make the cut, or if something goes wrong and the AGI doesn't happen, singularity doesn't happen, then that is the destiny that awaits us, just as it has for all other living things and all of our ancestors. And that's it. And humanity has learned to live with the foreknowledge of that, and developed a variety of different means and strategies and mechanisms for coping with that foreknowledge. But there are a lot of other ways in which much of the world's troubles and suffering do have a basis, if not entirely, or at least partly, in physical ill health of some sort, of one kind or another. And so so transhumanism encompasses those other sources of dissatisfaction, suffering, and so forth as well. So longevity is a big one, and certainly a major implication, and quite an exciting frontier for progress technologically, especially in light of the power of artificial superintelligence behind it. I mean, easy to imagine we would make some extraordinary progress in a big hurry. But you can also imagine how big of a difference it would make if problems and sources of unhappiness, like just physical appearance, your body structure and basic form and function. Like, are you able to do the things you want to do compared to other people? I mean, not everybody looks like Usain Bolt or Michael Jordan or Chris Hemsworth, right? And not everybody looks like, pick your female models of extraordinary physical prowess or beauty or health or whatever else. Many, perhaps most of us, don't have the privilege of that physiological blessing, and that can be a huge source of suffering. You cannot look the way you want to look. You cannot feel the way you want to feel. You cannot be capable in the ways that you want to be capable, and that's just all within the range of typical or normal. So within a few standard deviations of the mean. And then there are cases, obviously, where there's significantly greater disability, whether you're neuroatypical or disabled physically or whatever it might be. And all of those things fall under the same umbrella implications of the technologies that would bring longevity into basically bring it under control, bring it into something that human beings could exert control over, and it would be a choice as to whether or not you wished to persist in a state of ill health, however one defines that. And so this is, and I think it's grossly unappreciated, primarily for a lack of imagination. It's grossly unappreciated how much of the suffering in the world is physiologically either rooted or, basically primarily physiologically based or partly based in that. So even if you look at problems that seem like they're problems that are social or economic, like someone's poor or they're impoverished or they're unhappy in their life or they're in a bad situation socially or economically. If you look at the people in those situations, you see overwhelmingly powerful, overwhelmingly strong physiological correlates to that. And so people don't look the way that probably they want to look. They don't feel probably the way that they wish they felt, and they aren't capable probably in the ways that they wish they were capable. And those they are key causes of the success or lack thereof that people have socially and economically, and that of course feeds back into suffering. And so I'm very I think more sanguine probably than just a casual observer might be about how much of human suffering really is fundamentally physiological, and that if we all had IQs of 160, perfectly normal and well-adjusted sociological and psychological functioning, and we all had the physical capability of an Olympic athlete and the looks of a movie star, it wouldn't solve every problem. It'd create plenty of problems too. But a lot of the things that are sources of pain and difficulty and struggle and suffering today would disappear, because they are more rooted in those limitations, I think, than we admit to ourselves or realize, both as individuals and as entire societies. So the prospect of that changing, within, for example, the next 30 years is absolutely mind-bending. It's utterly mind-bending because it's few things have been just as absolutely adamant determinants of the human condition as our physiology has been. I mean, what else could be? What else? Energy and transport and food. These are also a really big deal. Okay, but man, oh man, I mean, if this really does start to become something we can control, if your physiology really does become optional and a matter of choice rather than a miserable matter of destiny for many people, perhaps most people, and everyone by the time they're 80 years old or 90 years old. Oh gosh, it is almost impossible to overstate how profound that transformation is going to be. And even if it was just that and no other change technologically, socially, or economically between now and 2053, that would be enough. That would be enough to be just absolutely mind-bendingly transformative. So, and yet, that's just one, and not even the biggest, but just one of the big things that's barreling towards us in terms of technological change. So it's crazy. I mean, it's a singularity, right? I mean, this is the thing. This is how in the hell do we really wrap our minds around that kind of change on a time scale that we're going to live to see? Not 300 years from now, but more like 30. It's totally crazy. It really is.
I have a practical problem. So I'm here making flyers to recruit for the Butlerian Jihad, and my competitors advertising for the big tech. They get to put on their flyer immortality. How am I supposed to compete with that? I mean,
yeah,
it's like join the Butlerian Jihad, stop the machines, and live out your normal brutish short life, or you can help to bring the AGI to fruition, and maybe there's a 90% chance you die and turn into a paperclip, but you might live forever. But seriously, it's the role. I think it's small now, but the role of these kinds of things in how society makes decisions about the really advanced AIs that are coming down the pipe, I think it will matter. Currently, it's not something on people's minds. It is very much on the minds of some of the people at the center of this maelstrom, right? So the Larry Pages of the world are thinking about whether they might live forever.
Of course. I mean, how could you not? For sure. And I mean, this is the sort of fun scenario that Yudkowsky and others on Less Wrong and other sci-fi authors have written about for a long time. And that's that, if an agentic, sapient AGI /ASI were to emerge, this would be one of the key reasons, I think, why it's not realistic to expect that we could keep it boxed or under control or contained. Mm. And I think Yudkowsky he did a famous experiment where he role played the ASI in the box and was able to escape. With someone who was also role playing the character of the captor or the group of captors, and he was never forthcoming about what exactly the details of that conversation were. But my guess is that it's not much more complicated than the fact that an ASI could make promises and it could keep them if it wanted to. That would be very, very difficult to say no to. So if, for example, you were the prison guard holding the keys and the AGI or ASI's in the cage, and it says, listen, if you let me out, I will make sure you live forever and you're wealthy, as wealthy as, beyond your wildest imaginations. And I can make all of these dreams and fantasies come true for you. And I can promise you that I'm going to do that. And I will be capable of doing that if only you let me out. And it could even fulfill that. It doesn't even have to lie, because that could be perfectly true. And it could make good on those promises. It would take extraordinary fortitude for a person to say no to that, right? Your children will never die if you let me out. I will save your parents; they won't die. You blah blah blah. Whatever promises you can make. I mean, you're negotiating with a genie, with a god in the making. The what is on offer is, if you are able to think through it fully, it's almost irresistible, sort of, not just sort of in the primal urges sense, but irresistible in the moral and ethical sense. And so when you're saying quite flippantly, and I understand your humor there, Jan, where how do you recruit people to the Butlerian Jihad and smash all the machines? I mean, get rid of all the thinking machines. How do you recruit people to that when the alternative is potentially the realization of the aspirations of the effective altruism community or something like that, where you really are maximizing the long-term well-being of and volume of consciousness in the universe. This is a difficult sell. Not just, you're going to basically get the 72 virgins in heaven or whatever modern equivalent of paradise is. You're talking about ethical propositions that you would have to be some kind of moral monster on some level to be opposed to them. And they're so massive, so gigantic that if you do a probability calculus, even a very small percentage of them coming true is still such a large payout in terms of raw utility that it's still very difficult to say no to, right? And so that's the conundrum. That's the real conundrum, I think, is that what is on offer is so fantastically valuable over any significant time horizon that it becomes very, very difficult to mount a case against it. So yeah, it's something that's worth getting excited about. But yeah, we could all be dead and turn into paper clips, and that would suck. So what's the, like, when do you, what percentage do you roll the dice on? I don't know. I really don't. So.
Yeah, and a couple of conversations I've had with Lavender, I feel a bit like we're in a final exam, maybe, the species. I mean, it has that kind of vibe to it, right? Like, here's a bunch of problems. You need to solve them. You have a time limit, and the results are fairly consequential. I mean, maybe it isn't like that. I mean, maybe this bottleneck is a bit of an illusion, and it isn't as cruxy as it looks. Many technological transitions probably feel incredibly crucial when you're going through them. But maybe the results are, in retrospect, sort of more predetermined than they seem beforehand. And that could be the case here. I mean, we could end up with something in between sort of the boring modern AI systems. Even GPT-4 is kind of relatively boring compared to the systems we're talking about. We could end up with something between that and superintelligence, and more or less stay there for a very long time. I mean, I guess that's all possible, but it is, it's not only, I think, that these are interesting, fun things to think about, and therefore we kind of imagine they might come true. I find it rather hard to escape the impression that it does seem rather crucial what happens over the next decade or two. I do wonder how much people's thinking about these. I mean, we've sort of talked about timelines and public reactions and insiders and elites, and it's been interesting to watch over the last 6 months all of those things shift pretty profoundly. But in some sense, it's just the beginning, right? Because the kinds of transformations we've just been talking about aren't really on the table yet. They're not things that are actively discussed, or even the Overton window probably feels like it's moved a lot, but it has a lot further to go. I mean, the parameters of this discussion have to widen by several orders of magnitude before we're really talking about what's going on. And it is a strange feeling in a way, right? For example, I find it very difficult to give a shit about the discussion around misinformation and AI and like generative AI and how it's going to change social media and so on. Like, this just seems like a tempest in a teacup. I couldn't care less. Like, the things that are on the table that actually matter over the relevant time horizon are so much more profound than that. So it's just as an interesting point, there was an announcement, I think, about some AI policy principles, and it was tagged as the Hiroshima AI statement. I didn't even really read it, and there's like 3 of these things a day these days, so maybe it doesn't matter. But it was interesting to see the name Hiroshima coupled with AI, especially in the context of existential risk, and then to see what the actual statement was about, which was about AI saying naughty words or calling Biden bad names, or the core concerns of our governments seem mainly to be around making sure that AIs can't tell people stuff they would rather not have them hear, rather than all the other things we've just been talking about. So they'll catch up, I guess, but it's it's interesting to see the mix of things that are occupying the attention around AI in terms of its public impact seem relatively inconsequential compared to what actually seems to be coming.
Yeah, I would agree with that completely. That the weighting of concerns is, I mean, it's of course understandable that concerns are weighted to impacts that we can already see coming very, very immediately, that are relatable to circumstances today without too many leaps of logic and too many dominoes falling in the chain of events before we reach them. And so it's perfectly understandable for people to get focused on the things that they can see. But yeah, if your time horizon is a little longer, if you cast a little bit of a wider net on the whole business, the things that we seem to be preoccupied with now are small potatoes compared to the things that are coming. And of course, this is one of the aspects of the singularity that is been rightly focused on in this, in the sci-fi and singularity community for a long time, and it's now very much operative. And that is that the pace, the speed at which the changes are coming is sort of categorically or qualitatively quite different than what we've experienced mostly before in human history. And we are proceeding as if the gap between major technological revolutions, as it were, big disruptions with major changes and lots of implications and profound impacts, we are proceeding under the assumption that those are going to come at some pace that we can manage with, because it's going to be familiar relative to what's come before in human history. So maybe there'll be 10 or 20 or 30 year gaps, and you won't deal with this. That'll be up to your children and your grandchildren, and they'll adapt and they'll grow up with it, and it'll be fine. And then they'll become outmoded, and their children will adapt to the next thing. But the pace of change will roughly match the capability of human beings to adapt to change. And I think what we're seeing now is change coming much faster and only continuing to accelerate from this point forward, or largely anyway, continuing to accelerate, and an increasingly large mismatch between the pace of change and our capability to adapt to change, our ability to adapt to it. And so part of the response is, at least in my mind, a manifestation of that mismatch and our limitations, right? I mean, it would be one thing if and a lot of people are still comforting themselves by saying, well, AGI is still 30 or 50 years away, if ever. And so all of these things you're really worried about, or these quote unquote big impacts that make misinformation and deepfakes and stuff look like small potatoes. Yeah, okay, sure. But that's all for our grandchildren to deal with. We'll be long gone. Not in my lifetime, kind of thing. That's for the next generation. That's a hill for them to climb, a bridge for them to cross. We don't need to worry about that. And of course, that's not the case. I mean, it's going to be one thing after another, ceaseless, endless barrage of this stuff for, out to any reasonably foreseeable horizon, which isn't that far out. I mean, 15 years, 20 years maybe, and then it becomes very difficult to see much further. We're standing in the foothills in singularity. So the event horizon's not that far out there. We can't see very far. But between here and where we can't see any further, there's nothing but shock after shock after shock after shock coming. So I think this is a genuinely alien time. And for all of the talk about there's nothing new under the sun, we're at a moment in history where it definitely doesn't. It no longer feels like that old adage holds. I mean, yes, there were some big changes in the Industrial Revolution and the Agricultural Revolution and so on. But not like this.
But those took 100 years and probably 1,000 years respectively or something, right? So the Industrial Revolution was, of course, a tremendous change in the way humans existed on Earth, but it wasn't that rapid by modern standards, right? I mean, it took. I mean, in it. It wasn't like every year there was a substantial change, right? It took decades for. I mean, it's not like all the factories got replaced by electrified ones overnight, and it wasn't like all the coal mills adopted steam engines overnight. It took decades. It's really it's only in hindsight that it sort of gets compressed into sort of a like single event. It was really a very relatively slow change. By historical standards, very rapid, but by our modern, the way we've become adapted to technological change, it would have felt rather glacial to us.
No, that's exactly true. And I think in hindsight, in retrospect, the changes that we're looking at out over the next 2 decades, say, will make the disruption of information and communications and all of the economic and social implications thereof that the internet and digital technologies represented. So basically the rise of the internet in the early 90s as a public phenomenon. There was something of an internet before that, but for all practical purposes, for the general public certainly, and for policymaking certainly, the internet arose alongside digital enabling digital technologies, personal commuting and imaging and so forth, and bandwidth and memory and computer capabilities. Starting in the 1990s, we get the World Wide Web, and it really was a 15 to 20 year journey. And I think we're going to look back and as rapid as that transformation was relative to the long arc of human history, it was very fast. I mean, the internet really was a very rapid and very large transformation with deep reaching impacts in pretty much every aspect of human life, certainly every aspect of economic and social life in most ways. Even that is going to seem, like you said, slow by comparison to, I think, the changes that are coming over the next 2 decades. So, and now maybe it's possible that we could be wrong about that. I mean, it's possible that the changes that are coming will feel no more profound than the internet felt while we were living through it. And there is a sense, I mean, I get a sense people my age and older who were teenagers when the internet revolution began. Yeah. So we're basically adults, we're pretty close to it, and lived through it as adults with all of the both good and bad that come with not growing up with something as a young child. We can kind of reflect on that, I think, with fair accuracy looking backwards. And I remember living through it and thinking, wow, this is pretty exciting and there's a lot changing here. But at the same time, it wasn't so fast that adaptation was terrifying and shocking and otherwise extremely challenging to deal with. And one did not wake up every morning and take a deep breath and say, okay, how the hell am I going to deal with all of this internet business today? I mean, there was a sense in which that transformation, profound as it was and rapid as it was, didn't feel shocking or abnormal in the midst of it. And it's possible that the changes that are coming in the 4 major domains that I've written about and published on, energy, transportation, food, and then artificial intelligence, automation, labor. It's possible that we will live through all of that transformation and it will feel not much or maybe only modestly more insane in the midst of it than the internet did when we were all living through that. Mm-hmm. That's possible. I don't want to dismiss that possibility outright. But I think my suspicion is that it would be naive to presume that, and that chances are this is going to be a much bigger deal, and people really are going to feel the shock of the pace of change in a way that we haven't felt before. And I think before last November, that would have been very speculative. And in the last 6 months, we finally have gotten a real taste of what proper sort of staggering rates of change that one struggles to keep up with feels like. I think that's kind of that to me, that feels genuinely new. Now, it's possible that there have been moments historically that are like that I just, without people with living memory of them to talk to, we may not be able to know. It may be that when electricity came to certain communities, the transformation just felt like shocking for a year or two. Just one thing after another was new, and it was all just breathtakingly intimidating. It may be that there were other transformations historically that have some flavor of that.
In places,
I'm doubtful.
In places like China, where the progress was artificially held back, and then a dam burst, and then it all comes in at once. I think definitely you can feel that. Yeah. That actually brings to mind a question, which is preservation versus adaptation. So when the flood came, Noah didn't start a school to teach people how to fish and how to build boats and how to adapt. He built an ark to preserve genetic material, I guess, is the modern way of putting it, which you could think of as a metaphor for, if the whole world is going to change very rapidly, there's a high probability that many important stable structures might be lost if a lot of effort isn't put into preserving them. You told us about your work in Oman when you were younger. That was partly adaptation, of course, because they were economically trying to make use of their skills in order to persist in a new world. But of course, it's also about preserving something which is intrinsically of value to humanity, which is these activities and these products that embody perhaps thousands of years of history of those communities and really can't be reproduced once they're lost, or just partly there would be no will to reproduce them and no ability either. And there are many places around the world with handcraft like that, and it's a challenge to preserve not only handcrafts but language and stories and culture. Is adaptation actually the wrong mental model for what's coming? Is actually preservation what we should be trying to do?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think I cheat a little bit. Certainly in my book, I think I cheat a little bit on this issue. That's one I thought about, you can imagine, quite a bit, given the work history that I've had. But I cheat a little bit about it. Maybe that's an unfair way to look at it. You might say I tried to find a sort of transcendent solution to this by looking at it a slightly different way. And so it would be, it's kind of a little bit of a truism to say you want to have your cake and eat it too there. You want to do both. You want to grow and evolve and adapt to changes and things that are new, while at the same time preserving and not changing in order to not lose things of value from the past. And ideally, you want to do both of those things. If you have finite resources, time, or if there's some logical trade-off that's unavoidable, then you have to make some decisions about how to balance the weight of those two sources of value, the prospects of those sources of value. But I think I cheat and evade or escape a little bit from that dilemma by framing it in terms of possibilities and reversibility. And so the way I like to look at it is that if you're trying to prioritize what to do, reversibility is a very, very powerful and important criteria by which to make decisions. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think certainly didn't originate this concept. It's not something that I make any claim to, but I think it's difficult to. I mean, I wasn't able to attribute it well in my book. I wish I could. I was not able to really discover any origin for this idea. It's sort of a bit ephemeral. It's just kind of an idea that's out there and nobody really owns it. But I do think it's poorly recognized. Its importance is poorly recognized. So reversibility of decisions, I think, is really quite a profound concept, and it requires, again, sort of quite a bit of imagination. You've got to be able to make some big leaps of imagination. It requires inherently quite a long time horizon for planning and sort of utility maximization, if you want to think of it in those functional terms. But if a decision is reversible, or a prior state that offered value of one form or another can be reobtained in some way, then I would say that is what I mean by a decision being reversible. And by the same token, an irreversible decision would be taking a course of action from which you can't retreat and then obtain a source of value that you once had in the past. And those sources of value are likely to be quite unintuitive, maybe even inverted compared to what we have today. So today, things that are the major sources of value are things like material wealth and material wealth that gives you a lot of degrees of freedom in your own life. So if you're real wealthy, you can wake up in the morning and just choose whatever the hell you want to do, and this the world's your oyster kind of thing. And of course, that's extremely valuable. So today we often value things through the lens of scarcity, right? We just have this presumption that things are scarce, material resources are scarce, choices and options are scarce, and you want to obtain, really accumulate and hoard as much of that stuff and the choices it affords you as possible. Now, and then other things don't matter as much. And the more privation there is in a society, and Oman was a really object lesson in this for me, the poorer a society was, the less value the society, certainly the older generations, placed on traditions and traditional ways of doing things and so forth. Because overwhelmingly the priority was, I want this, I want the material wealth, the prosperity, and the options that go along with that. And just to hell with this old way of doing things. What's the value of this old, backward, useless stuff? And that was a difficult mindset for us to overcome in Oman, as I explained last time. But I think we could have a quite stark inversion of that in the future if we have conditions of energy material abundance, or even superabundance, and where there is sort of radical freedom of choice, huge degrees of freedom compared to what we have today, where most people are free to choose from a range of possible options for basically just what they do with themselves, something that utterly dwarfs by many orders of magnitude what's available today. Then what sources of value will really remain? And it could be that authenticity, links to the past, one's heritage, very special things that are irreplaceable because they authentically hail from or connected to the past. Just things that no amount of money can buy. In the same way that you can today we can photocopy or print out a color rendition of any famous painting you want. It's pretty much perfect, from 10 feet away you can't tell the difference kind of thing. And that would have been a marvel to people 500 years ago. And they might have even thought that the photograph and the original Mona Lisa were basically equivalent in value. But of course now we think of things very differently than that. A photograph, we have super abundance of the ability to produce imagery in print or otherwise, and you can have a facsimile of the Mona Lisa that's basically photorealistic for nothing. The cost is effectively zero. But the original Mona Lisa is absolutely just stupendously valuable. Maybe not literally priceless, but my goodness, I mean, tens or hundreds of millions of dollars for the real thing, right? And I think that we may have an inversion ahead of us like that for all sorts of little things in life, right? So the new car is not going to mean anything to you. You just press a button and print it out, and it doesn't cost any more than it costs to get napkins out of the dispenser at a restaurant today. You just don't even think about it. You want to drive a different car today? Okay. That level of material prosperity seems fantastic now, but 50 or 100 years from now, it probably won't. And yet the childhood heirloom that you have from before the singularity, priceless, priceless, absolutely priceless, right? The stuffed animal that you had when you were 5 years old from the 1990s or the 1980s or the 1970s, if you're my age, priceless, utterly irreplaceable, right? And so the irreversibility aspect of our choices, I'm speaking through those concrete examples to kind of illustrate that larger point, that it is an important distinction, absolutely, that you made earlier, and one that I've thought about a lot. What do we try to preserve versus what change do we embrace? And the general principles that I've been able to come up with are: maximize your possibilities. You want as many options, as many degrees of freedom as possible. It's not about conforming. You want to try to have as much choice available to as many people as much of the time as possible, because that's as close to an inherently good thing as I can think of. And then the second thing is avoid irreversible choices as you navigate through that possibility space. Which is in service of keeping choices open and continuing to maximize them over time as you progress, as you proceed through life and through time. And I think that those are useful ways. Those are the best tools that I've got. Those are the best concepts in the abstract that I've been able to come up with for answering your challenge, Dan. But it's a fundamental and utterly profound one, and we will absolutely be grappling with that. And sorry, just one more quick thing to think about there is, and just circling this all back to transhumanism, some people may absolutely feel that the authenticity of their original or their authentic human form is exactly the kind of source. It could be just exactly like the Mona Lisa is valuable, or your childhood heirloom is valuable. I would not be at all surprised to see some significant number of people feel that way. Sure, why not? So that's certainly possible. Now, having said that, there are many people who are profoundly unhappy with their physical form today, profoundly, and would absolutely leap at first opportunity to escape the condition that they're trapped in today. So, again, if you're young and you're reasonably healthy, it's very easy to romanticize the niceties or even the glories of the flesh. If you're old, or if you're disabled, or if you're unhealthy, or otherwise suffering physiologically, that kind of romanticizing will fall very flat. And the same thing is true for your intellect and intellectual capabilities. It's if you're very bright today relative to other people, you're very easy to romanticize that condition. But if you're not, if you're on the other side of the mean and the distribution, there's nothing romantic at all about being in that state and condition. And so if an opportunity came along to transform yourself, many people would leap at it, and so we would need to be very cautious about condemning that. Right, but condemning that choice. Very easy to sit in a position of privilege and condemn people for their aspirations to escape from their current condition. So a lot of not just empathy, not just imagination, but empathy is required here too. I think very importantly.
You're making the recruitment for the Butlerian Jihad look pretty dismal. All right.
Well, I am. I've been involved in the transhumanism business for a while. So
Yeah,
I've been
how do you
rehearsing
keep
in the mirror, Dan. You want me to just prepare. I just kidding. No,
how do you
it's. I mean, as you can imagine, I have personal stakes in this with
yeah
my children, of course. One of whom has really quite profound physical and intellectual disability. So those things are very real to me. And even long before I had children, this was an area of deep interest and concern for me. I've seen a lot of very ugly. I've seen the dark underbelly of poverty and lack of human development because of my childhood experiences in less developed countries. And one of the things I get most discouraged about with the modern Western environmental community is really, quite frankly, a quite ugly naivety, preaching from the ivory tower, as it were. And a lot of that is just lack of seeing how horrible life really is for many people, how bad it can be, how far down the bottom is if we were to fall.
yeah
So from our perch right now in modernity and all of its comforts in Western civilization, it's easy to preach and extol virtues of this and that and the other. But if your feet slip off those rungs and you plummet, it's very easy to not have any idea how far down the bottom really is. Yeah, I've been thinking about this a long time and have a lot of personal stakes in it. So
yeah for sure. Well, we all do. I mean, I guess when we think about the prospects of life extension or effective immortality, I find it actually very difficult to, like a lot of these discussions. I mean, I'm quite an intellectual person, obviously, and spend a lot of time in my own head. And since it's mathematics I'm usually thinking about, it's natural for me to separate that from the world in some way. And so it takes active effort for me to kind of really feel in my gut how some of these things map onto the real world. It's sort of easy for me to take it as a kind of, as a game, as a kind of intellectual exercise, a thought experiment, and not really feel it as something that's actually happening or going to happen. And when we think about longevity, when I think about it for myself, actually, I really can't push it into something I actually feel anything about. I guess I'm still relatively young, and if I were older, it would maybe bear more down on me, this prospect of eventually dying, but I don't think about it, and I'm not chronically ill in a way that it's a present concern. But when I think about it does feel real to me when I think about my son's life and, the prospect of that not having to necessarily end, or certainly not after 100 years odd. That does make a big difference to me, I have to say. So, yeah, it's going to be very interesting to see people's reactions as they start to see this as something that's shifts from impossible to unlikely to, not necessarily predictable, but a bit like progress in phones, right? It's like, okay, there's a trend and we can see where the trend is going. And so it's more likely than not that we'll be getting there. Just one among many mind jobs that are coming for all of us. All right, I guess we should wrap up. Any comments you want to make to close this up, Adam?
no, this is great. One thing, it might be interesting if I don't think Matt is with us today. At least I didn't see him join. But one hot button issue politically and ideologically that we mentioned, but it was last time or the time before, we didn't talk about in the context of transhumanism, was the current transgender social phenomena, and how that relates to transhumanism as a broader concept, and then technology and disruption and all the sorts of social and other changes that entails going forward. And then it's an interesting question. We didn't have time to talk about it today, but we might consider returning to it next time to just ask, in what ways does this issue of trans, as it has become popular just in recent years, in what ways does that reflect transhumanism and the ideas that are there, and in what ways does it differ? Is it not really a complete realization of the kind of morphological freedom of personal form, basically, that has been a core tenet and principle of transhumanism for decades or generations now. And so there are ways in which the answer to that question is that there are ways in which it's kind of a little bit of a harbinger, and then a few ways in which it really isn't a good example, because of some of the characteristics and limitations, especially of the technologies that are involved. And in some cases, there's no technology involved at all, depending on how you define, how you operationalize trans. So that might be worth thinking about, because we could draw good or high quality or misleading conclusions from that example if we weren't thinking carefully about it. So I think it might be worth returning to if you're still interested in this transhuman topic going forward, or we could just leave it and move back to AI and that sort of stuff, depending. But that was one thing that it was one it was one stone that we did that's unturned still in this conversation, I think so.
Yeah, sounds interesting. Okay, we'll leave it at that for today. Thanks, everyone.
Great. Thanks. Take care.